Welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Let's call this part 7 of Mussolini, an Italian-American perspective. And tonight, I'm going incognito for this episode, ladies and gentlemen. Just gonna keep the camera off. I'm having some issues with my eyesight and migraines, things of that nature. So I'm just gonna keep it off tonight. But I'll be back soon here. But tonight, I want to talk to you about Mussolini's intervention in the Spanish Civil War, which is fascinating. And in many ways, it really highlights and becomes a precursor to dividing lines in World War II. Spain is fascinating because it is, you have the king, I think it's King Alfonso XIII, who abdicated the throne in 1931. Let's remember, starting with the American Revolution, but then really in Europe, exacerbating through the French Revolution, the Enlightenment set in motion effectively a political revolution, right, throughout the entire globe. The Protestant Reformation was the first step, right? Because it was an attack against the altar. It was an attack against the faith. The moment you could begin to break down the faith within Christendom, the political systems, which got their legitimacy from the church, especially the monarchs, those can now be attacked. It was a three-pronged step, right? As historian Charles Colomb has said, right? The attack on the Christian world was an attack against altar, throne, and family. The altar was attacked at the Protestant Reformation. The throne was attacked at the Enlightenment. And the past century has been an attack by the Marxists against the family. And keeping that in mind, what happened after the French Revolution in Europe was a widespread wave of moral depravity that begins to hit all of Europe. Now, some pockets of Europe did resist that moral depravity. But in the big cities, and we see the liberalization of Europe, particularly in places like France, Spain was one of them. It hit Italy to a certain respect in the big cities, though Italy was able to maintain its Catholicity pretty strong. It hits, obviously, all the northern Protestant nations, that Protestant Reformation marginal line, as you see the Scandinavian nations and the Netherlands and England and all these Anglo-Protestant nations really liberalized at the time of the Enlightenments. And you have all these dividing lines where things remain more solid in lots of the southern European nations and out east as well, too, to a certain degree. And these were, in many ways, the challenges that monarchies faced throughout the entire 19th century. It's interesting to read through 19th century history, a part of history that I took for granted when I was a lot younger because I didn't understand it. And it was a complexity of doctrines and treaties amongst different countries that were trying to work out their differences and trying to coexist in Europe. When in fact, what we see throughout the entire 19th century is this complexity that kind of is the offshoot of the French Revolution, where a wave of Enlightenment ideas is sweeping through Europe, causing chaos in what was once an old Catholic world, and a confrontation with Christendom effectively. And through this, we begin to see the collapse of monarchical systems all over Europe. And this has come full circle. Some nations collapsed a lot faster. Some monarchies were overthrown. Some monarchies just abdicated the throne. I think Spain, being really a hotbed of the Catholic world for so long, being a great defender of Holy Mother Church for many centuries, held on for as long as it could in many respects. And even after General Franco, it tried to hold on at least through his sort of fascist governance there, right? Now, when I say Franco was a fascist, I use that term very loosely, right? Because as I told you guys so many times before, true fascism only existed in Italy. and only in Italy, right? It was an idea concocted by the fascist philosophers, the Italian philosophers like Giovanni Gentili, and ultimately Benito Mussolini, as Benito Mussolini molded it through his years in power into another variation of sorts, right? Because Mussolini was always very malleable with his ideology. It has been said that the thing about Mussolini is that he sat down and he listened to all points of view, and he was very non-dogmatic. He looked at things from a standpoint, what is the most practical policy while still honoring our values, our principles, our faith, and our beliefs at the end of the day. And this is why you could have a Mussolini that transforms radically from this radical Marxist, goes from being an atheist at the beginning of his life to converting to the Catholic faith, which is what I believe toward the end of his life. And so this is a fascinating transformation. And so Spain finds itself in the midst of this liberal revolution that had been sweeping Europe throughout this century and a half. And by 1931, from my understanding, and now listen, I'm not an expert on Spanish history, okay? And so I'm sure there's people that can articulate this message better than I can, but I have taken a look at it, especially within the framework and the context of Italian history and Italy's involvement in the Spanish Civil War. Now, by 1931, King Alfonso XIII abdicates the throne. We have this wave and pressure for the past century of taking down monarchs. Freedom, liberty, democracy is sweeping the world, particularly in Europe. And his time came, and for whatever reason, feels the need to leave the throne behind. And what does that mean for Spain? Well, of course, democracy now reigns in Spain, because that was the wave of the world at the time. And it's interesting because after 1931, they concoct an electoral system that I don't completely understand, but from my understanding, I'm quoting here Luigi Villari, right? His book, Italian Foreign Policy under Mussolini. So I'm giving you as close of a direct primary resource as I could find, right? Luigi Villari being in the Italian Foreign Office. He was a diplomat in England, a diplomat in America, and he can help us bridge this gap between the Anglo world and the Italian world. And this is what the book is essentially about, trying to explain what the foreign policy thinking of the Italians was. And according to, Villari, we have a problem in Spain as this electoral system they set up. It's a system that can be manipulated by a minority within the electoral process, right? Listen, it's like I told you before, communists will use any means to acquire power. They don't play by the same rules as Christians play, or Christian people play, in that sense, where we have a certain set of rules and virtues and standards. Communists will lie, they will cheat, they will steal, they will indoctrinate kids, they will take over institutions, they will take over the corporations, they will take over governments, they will take over libraries, they will take over education systems, they will take over universities, they will take over the media, they will take over Hollywood, they will take over every facet of our civilization. And in many ways, we're living through that right now, right? And I think most Americans feel it and sense it. And so when this electoral system, if you want to call it that, was set up, it was set up in a way where a minority could potentially gain power in Spain. And the election of 1936 comes around, and the communists come into power using this electoral system, which is interesting, because now communists are using democracy as a means to acquire power. And why wouldn't they? They don't play by the same rules anybody else plays. Now, they come into power, and immediately chaos ensues, because the revolution has to march forward, right? The first thing they do is they start destroying the churches. They start to abuse and kill priests. They start raping nuns. They dig up bodies of dead nuns and place them up in a form of desecration. They ban marriage. They collectivize all land. They take away all private property. The revolution in Spain is kicking into full gear in 1936. This is it. The Bolsheviks now have a foothold in Western Europe. And of course, it's a problem for a lot of people. Because even though the communists, the socialists, and the anarchists, which were the main, antagonists, you want to call it that, they were in a position where they were a minority in the country, but because of the electoral system, it gave them power. And as we know, in our electoral system here in America, we know that you can win in various ways, right? You don't have to have, we have an electoral college system. You don't have to win the popular vote in America in order to become president of the United States. You got to win the electoral votes. That's why we've had recently a couple of presidents win without a majority vote. Now, I'm not sure how the Spanish system was set up. I would have to look into that. But that's the kind of situation that Luigi Villari explains. And here come the communists in power, and the revolution begins. And the abuses, the atrocities in Spain begin. Now, for most Catholics that are being persecuted there, it's obviously an uphill battle. You got General Franco that's been pushed off the Spanish mainland. He's been kind of kicked to the curb out in Morocco, where he's got his troops over there. He's a general. He's a devout Catholic. He's kind of watching this. And I think there was some confusion early on which one of the generals would actually step in and kind of take control of the troops as the Civil War started. But for Mussolini, he's kind of an outsider looking at this from his perspective. And of course, as you guys know, Mussolini fought communism in Italy in the 19-teens and 1920s. And in that situation, in Italy at the time, it was the Russians and the Bolsheviks that were infiltrating into Italy. That's why one of Mussolini's famous quotes was something like, listen, 1917, the Tsar of Russia falls, 1918, the Kaiser in Germany falls, 1919, we have a Russian army camped out in Italy. The communists were moving west. And the only people that really saw this coming was the likes of Benito Mussolini. Because this would play a big role later on, a lot of the blind attitudes that Western liberals would have toward communism. And one of the great successes of communism was during that World War II period, convincing Western allies that the only true totalitarian force on the face of the planet was fascism and not communism. Communism was able to convince the Anglos primarily that they were not a threat. Let's remember, in Winston Churchill's famous speech in Missouri about the Iron Curtain, this is how late to the party the Anglos were to finally figuring out what actually happened in World War II. And what we find out is the classical liberals were played for fools throughout that whole thing. That doesn't excuse the crimes of the failed Austrian painter. But these alliances were much more complex. That's the point here. And the Spanish Revolution was a microcosm of what was to come 3 years, 4 years later, when the Second Great War started. What were the alliances in the Spanish Civil War? I've mentioned this in the previous podcast in this series. On the Republican side, the government side that just won the election, remember that, right? They won an election. That's how they got into power. They used the vehicle of democracy, the will of the people, to get into power. You had the communists, the socialists, and the anarchists. You always had some other divergent groups in there, kind of minority groups, but that was basically a far left of center revolutionary ideology on that side, right? Communists, socialists, radicals, and anarchists. Let's call it that. On the other side of the revolutionary fight was the nationalists. And what did they consist of? They consisted of the monarchists, the integralists, the fascists, and the church. The church. Yeah, that's right. The church. And these dividing lines were big during that period of the revolution, and this is where you see the consolidating forces of alliances come together. For Mussolini's part, and why Italy enters this war is, after fighting communists in Italy as he did, and really pushing the communists out and the Bolsheviks out for the most part, right? At least the international forces that were flooding in. Because, see, this is the problem with communism. It's an international ideology. You always had foreigners that were invading you. And this is what's happening in Spain. Because what would have happened in the Spanish Revolution is it's a foreign war. It's Stalin that's primarily sending in all the armaments and all of his ideologues in to fight this war on the Republican side. While the nationalist side is more of a true patriotic sense, a nationalist movement that loves Spain for what it is, its history, its tradition, and yes, even its Catholic faith. These were the dividing lines of the revolutions of the Masons. On the left were the godless atheists. On the right were the Catholics and the integralists and the church. This was the war in Spain. And which side did Mussolini intervene on? He came in on the side of Catholic Spain, of the church. Now, for Mussolini's part, he didn't want a communist satellite state in Spain, right next door to him. And that was the goal of the Bolsheviks. That was the goal of Stalin. Let's get our foot in the door in Western Europe. And from there, we can spread out and conquer the rest of Europe. After World War II, they had conquered all of Eastern Europe. The plan was to spread out to the rest of the world. And in many ways, they accomplished that in a more indirect manner. But in a direct fashion, he wanted the sickle and the hammer, the flag of the sickle and a hammer, planted in Spain, right there in the heart of the Catholic world. That was the goal. And here comes the rush of Bolsheviks and communists and socialists running to France to fight for the revolution in a Catholic nation like Spain. And Mussolini says, bullshit. Excuse my language. It ain't happening on my watch. And Mussolini intervenes. Now, the interesting thing about Mussolini's intervention was both sides argued that the Russian intervention into the war and the Italian intervention into the Spanish Civil War was illegal. From an international law point of view. And Mussolini says, fine, I'll stay out of it if Stalin stays out of it. But there's a kicker here. Mussolini's up front to the world. And it says, listen, I'm going into Spain to help out Franco. Period. The end. Stalin, on the other hand, is denying everything. Stalin makes no mention of it publicly. He tries to bring in his people secretly because communists work behind the scenes. This is how they infiltrate. Great secrecy. Secret societies. This is how they operate. This is why the infiltration of communism all over into the West today, nobody saw it coming. And because the moment you bring up some of these curious historical nuances, in the West, we have this thing, well, you're just a conspiracy theorist. Okay. But when you're telling me, I don't know what happened to America, this isn't the America I know, I don't know what happened to the America I know, you better start thinking that some conspiracies did happen. Not that everything in life or in politics is a conspiracy, but that conspiracies do happen. It is a possibility. And in this case, a secretive communist movement infiltrated to the West is more than documented now in places like the Venona Secrets or the Venona Project that talks about the infiltration of Soviet agents into all of Western Europe, including America. Are we still talking about conspiracy theories, people? Are we? Because it's happened. Okay, but that's my lecture. I digress. So for Mussolini, he's up front. For Mussolini, he's willing to pull his troops out if Stalin is willing to pull his troops out. But, of course, Stalin never gives any acknowledgement of such thing. And Mussolini proceeds to send about 50 to 60,000 Italian troops into Spain to assist Franco and to assist the patriotic Spaniards of that time to try to recapture their country from Bolsheviks. And in many ways, as the Civil War went, Franco had a lot of success. It took time. The Italians were there. The Italians did fairly well. They had some losses at times, but it was a great sacrifice Mussolini was willing to make. And the interesting thing about Mussolini's sacrifice in Spain was he asked for no stipulations from Franco. That's what's fascinating to me. He didn't say, okay, give me this, give me that. There was some rumors that Mussolini wanted an island or two in order to create a port, but nothing really came of it. We have no records of any stipulations that Mussolini wanted this. He helped purely for strategic and ideological reasons. One, he didn't like communists, and he understood what the sickle and flag in Spain would mean for the rest of Western Europe. But he had no stipulations, and that was one of Mussolini's frustrations with Franco, because Franco took his time. He could have won that war faster than the 3 years that it took, but he wanted to exhaust and ultimately evaporate the entire communist forces of Spain at the time. And Mussolini's like, wait a minute, man, I can't keep my troops there forever. And he kind of got stuck. It was kind of a mistake that Mussolini made to a certain degree, even though Franco and the nationalists won the war there. But it shows you where Mussolini was at in his thinking in many ways, right? We can't have communism in Western Europe. And he's willing to sacrifice Italian blood and Italian money because this was so important. He saw this as a problem. This is why when classical liberals align with communism later on, it becomes a problem because you gave legitimacy to the communist ideology. You accepted it as an equal partner at the table of power. You wonder why we're at in the West where we're at now? Especially when communism works in such a secretive manner with no moral concepts. This is a problem when you cut a deal with this ideology, at least with the fascists. You guys in the political right, especially here in America, have to acknowledge at least the fascists for their anti-democratic sensibilities, which you have. And I understand. I worry about authoritarian governments too. Don't get me wrong. I have my fears. But at least the fascists acknowledge natural law. The communists never acknowledged natural law. That was the problem. And when you don't acknowledge natural law, what good is your democracy? And we've seen it. They've used democracy not only in Spain, but throughout all of the West, even today, to take power over everybody's lives. And this is why nothing makes sense in America anymore, right? I wish you conservatives would look at this. Get out of that left and right paradigm, okay? So for Mussolini, it's really a survival of civilization. And Franco has success. He pushes, he fights. It's a bloody war. It's ugly, without a doubt. Listen, the atrocities are still talked about. And in Spain, after the war, right, there's always been, Franco's always been a controversial figure because of this. There was a thing a few years back where they think about digging up his grave because of all the great disrespect. And as usual, it's the church that's protecting his body. It's some monks in Spain that are protecting his body and fighting against the governments, because the propaganda after the war by the communists of the vanquished fascists, there was nobody left to defend the fascists, especially in Italy, right? Because the winners write history. And it was a massive propaganda campaign against fascism that the communists began. It started doing this not only against the failed Austrian painter, but against Mussolini. And then even Franco, even though Franco survives and governs pretty much till his death, I believe in the early 70s. And this is important to understand how propaganda works in war, right? And we've been given this narrative. Put on any YouTube video on the Spanish Revolution, or the Spanish Civil War, or Italy's reign in his lead up to take power in Italy, or even with the failed Austrian painter, it depicts things in this brutal manner that fascists only operate under tyrannical power. And yet, the even more oppressive measures of the communists is always underscored in these same documentaries, right? That's why when we get into the issues of fascists and communists fighting out, the fascists are the ones that are attacking usually, and it was the opposite, by the way. And the communists are not even communists; they're called partisans. Partisans, okay? Again, we're playing a game of words. We're playing a war of language here in this battle to the death with communists that are secretive organizations whose secrecy is designed to infiltrate and to set us up ultimately for the ultimate revolution and dominance of the West, which ironically enough would come 50, 60, 70, and 80 years later. So, but in this case, Franco pushes the nationalist forces back. He beats the nationalist forces. The last of the communist forces get on boats and they escape to France, a lot of them, because France had an alliance with Soviet Union. And what's interesting about the Villari book right now is the fact that, and I'm looking deeper into this, that in many ways, France was already a quasi-Marxist state. If specifically, Villari argues that really the entire government structure over there, the entire parliamentary system in France was really constructed of what? Socialists, radicals, and Freemasons, which effectively means France was already Marxist. It had already been taken over, and why not? At this point, you've had over 100 years of the French Revolution running its moral depravity all through that country. And this is essentially why the French and the Soviets at that time had an alliance, and the French go into the Spanish Civil War on the side of the Soviets. On the side of the Soviets. What does that tell you about France? It means they're gone. They're gone, ladies and gentlemen. That's not Catholic France anymore. They're gone. Yes, there's some help in there from the failed Austrian painter who sees an ideological ally in Franco, even though the failed Austrian painter is upset when Franco refuses to join the war effort in World War II. They say that when Hitler asked Franco to join the Axis in World War II, that Franco gave some rambling answer that was incoherent as a way to get out of that scenario. And oftentimes when you talk to a lot of Catholics, right, they will tell you how much they really appreciate Franco, and Franco fought the communists. He stood up for the church, and Franco is held as a hero in many respects by a lot of traditionalist Catholics in those in the Catholic world. And Mussolini oftentimes is kind of vanquished to the side. He's right, because the ultimate difference was, in the way we kind of differentiate this, Franco was a devout Catholic, and there's a history and there's a record there. And then at the end of the day, he does not ally himself with Hitler, right? Mussolini, on the other hand, his faith comes throughout the course of his life. It's a growing process, right? And this is where we get a conversion at the end from, according to some of the mystics that we have, and we see some evidence of that in his everyday life. But I believe it's that alliance with Hitler that turns everybody off, and in some ways, understandably so. Though, like I said, the other side of the aisle, there wasn't a whole lot of good guys either. Let's be honest, right? Our Lady said that war in Fatima, and I think also in Quito, Ecuador, in the apparitions of the 17th century, that war was a punishment for sin. And Europe, post-French Revolution, was drenched in moral depravity. And Europe paid the price twice for that moral depravity. At least that's according to Our Lady, or at least how I interpret her apparitions. And it's something to consider in retrospect. But I like to remind my Catholic friends, look at the scenario that Mussolini enters into with effectively nothing to gain. Nothing. It's about ideological principles with him, about keeping the sickle and hammer out of Western Europe, and he's willing to sacrifice for that, and willing to sacrifice his own power. Because remember, while Mussolini is called a dictator, he's really a prime minister, and the king has the final power in Italy at the end of the day, and that's how Mussolini is removed out of power by the king eventually. So it's not like Mussolini has the range to be able to do what he wants without consequence. Hitler was a true dictator. Franco becomes a true dictator. But Mussolini was never a true dictator. He never had ultimate power in Italy. So he was faced with accountabilities, right? I'll go back to the Matteo scandal, right? The socialist politician that died at the hands of fascists. Big controversy. He's walking on the side of the road, dragged into the car. They're trying to rough him up and scare him, things of that nature. Guy has tuberculosis. In the process, he has a heart attack and dies. That was by far the biggest domestic scandal that Mussolini ever suffered through. And so one loss of life almost cost him his prime ministership. The king could have removed them at any time if the people would have turned on Mussolini. There was always accountability then, right? At least in Italy, there was to a certain degree. But in this case, Mussolini sacrificed for what he believed was the right thing to do, with very little to gain. I mean, if you're going to tell me, okay, well, Franco probably was going to give him this port or that port for his name, fine. But how big of an accomplishment really is that? I'm not saying you don't take it if you're Italian, but geez, man, he's not even asking back. I don't even think he asked for the money back that he sacrificed for Italy. You can't give the loss of life back. You can't give the soldiers back, especially because he's already in Ethiopia in 1935. So now he's fighting two wars, right? And this is the reason why Italy's not ready when World War II breaks out, when Hitler's running all over the world. And we'll talk about that line some other time. But Italy's in Ethiopia, Italy's in Spain, and resources and soldiers and things of that nature are being used up at that point in history. So, the Spanish Civil War is over. Mussolini recalls his troops at a certain point, and the revolution is won by the nationalists. Now, of course, Franco takes over as a dictator over there. First thing he does, he celebrates Mass. He brings the church back into the fold. The communists, the socialists, the anarchists, the radicals are all vanquished as much as they can. There's stories about camps that Franco had, right? And according to the partisans, and I use that with quotes, picture me holding my fingers right to it, quote, end quote, right? The partisans, they say the camps were not in the best condition. And many partisans died in the camps. It's one of the things they tried to get Franco for. They say that, well, Franco didn't allow for any photographs of the camp, so that's why there's no evidence of that. So now we're being asked to trust communists that often lie oftentimes. I'm not saying that situation didn't happen, but whenever I hear talks about camps, which are horrible in all situations, you got to remember everybody had camps at that period in history when it came to war. Right? This is a period before mass transit, mass communications. Things are more difficult to manage at that time, and camps were set up. America had camps, right, with the Japanese. The British had camps in Bora Bora. The French had camps out in South America. The Italians had certain camps down in Ethiopia. The Spanish had camps. The Soviets had camps. Everybody had camps. Everybody at the time had camps. The question is, what were the conditions of that camp and what were their intended purposes, ultimately, at the end of the day? Obviously, we know what the failed Austrian painter did, which was an atrocity against humanity, an absolute crime against history. We get that. But oftentimes, camps were holding cells while the political circumstances of war worked themselves on the ground. Now, sometimes a lack of resources led to horrible conditions in these camps, without a doubt. And maybe things could have been done better. I can't speak for Spain because I don't know the situation of the camps in Spain, if the camps existed. Again, we're taking the word of communists who said that there were camps under horrible conditions. In the case of Italy, hard economic hardships, there were some camps. In America, in America, the Japanese camps here, right, which are described as horrible. I would imagine the Japanese camps in America under FDR were probably in better condition, mainly because America didn't have its infrastructure attacked. It printed money, and it was better off. The circumstances in America at home were a better situation, less vital in terms of not having to fight a war in your own land. So in that respect, I would probably say the American camps were probably the most humane, and understandably so, because of the circumstances in America, right? That's a possibility. I don't know. I've looked a little bit into the detainment of the Japanese in America. They weren't good, without a doubt. But I don't know if they were as bad as other camps. But again, conditions on the ground. And so with Spain, we get Franco that comes into power with the full endorsement of the church, and all these regimes that ultimately come together to celebrate what is the restoration of something that is pre-Enlightenment, I think, is what they're going for, right? Because remember the dividing line. I talked about this before, right? What do the monarchists, the integralists, and the church have in common at the time? They all want to go back to a time before the Enlightenment. The fascists come around, which is born out of liberalism. A lot of them were ex-socialists, ex-Marxists that kind of had a revelation about the problems of Marxism. And fascism is born within the midst of a liberal society, but they're kind of gravitating more to the right here, right? And so when this war breaks out in Spain, they join the National Society because they got massive problems with the communists. See, so that's why when you hear the likes of a Dinesh D'Souza say, well, fascism was an ideology of the left because they believe in a powerful, strong state. Okay, let's stop right there. The idea that a strong state, not central planning, because that's not what the fascists did. The fascists did believe in a strong state. Catholic nations can't operate under the dictates of strong governments. We built the West, Catholics did, under the regimes of monarchies, for crying out loud, right? See, this definition that fascism is a liberal movement is based upon the insecurities of an Anglo-Protestant ideology that rejected all authority at the Protestant Reformation, and then eventually, of course, at the Enlightenment. So anything that says, well, government has to be strong, to them in their mind, that makes it what? A leftist movement. But in the Catholic world, it's not about the size of government that matters. It's about the social constructs that government is founded upon. And if natural law and the church are in play, you can have a big government and be fine in a Catholic state. But in an Anglo-Protestant world that rejected the church, who's there to call fair and foul? Where's natural law? We got individual rights and we got religious liberty, right? Which means I get to be my own God. I get to be my own theology. I get to make up my own church as I go along. This is the anarchy that would come in the classical liberal world. This is what we're living through today. But in Spain, was Franco a leftist because he set up a strong central government? You got to understand that the terms and conditions that we use in the American political system is different than how we view politics in Europe. The embracement of Enlightenment principles naturally makes people like Dinesh D'Souza, Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, or Glenn Beck, all these right-wing talkers, they're actually men of the left because they embrace the liberalism of the Enlightenment. They are the leftists. They may not be as far left as the communists are, which, of course, communism is a full fruition of classical liberalism. We know that. But it's not the size, this abstract idea of the size of government that decides left or right in Europe or in the Catholic world. It is about the philosophy, the social constructs, natural law, and ultimately about our faith in Christ, an unbroken analogy of the faith that goes back for 2,000 years. That's what defines us in the Catholic world. And Mr. D'Souza, who's a fallaway Catholic for Protestantism, has no concept of this, which makes you wonder about his theology. And I will pray for Mr. D'Souza, but he's wrong on this issue. That's my point. But to sum this up, guys, For Mussolini, this was about an ideological war. It was about protecting Western Europe. It was about protecting Italy, because he himself was a Marxist. He understood exactly who Stalin was. Mussolini knew Lenin. Mussolini knew Stalin because he was a Marxist. But wait a minute. I know he knew Lenin personally. Did you know Stalin? I would say most likely he did, right? So he understood the nature of communist revolution. Nobody understood it better than him. This is why, again, when Winston Churchill is giving his Iron Curtain speech, you're like, well, wait a minute. It took you that long? It took the classical liberals that long to figure it out? How much infiltration was there in Western liberal republics by the Bolsheviks? Because they didn't see us coming. Now, I'm sure some of them saw it coming, but that's pretty amazing that we don't have this condemnation till after the Cold War starts. The West is reacting to the communist world, where the communist world was already churning 30, 40, 50 years earlier, and Mussolini is there every step of the way to tell the world, listen, this isn't good. This isn't good. And that's why I say the alliance between the Western liberals, America and England specifically, along with Joseph Stalin, was an absolute disaster that we're all paying for today. Spain is a microcosm of that. Mussolini picked the right side, whether you like them or not, whether you like authoritarian governments or not, right? I think this is clear, and most conservatives will understand this, that communism is a problem. Granted, you guys figured it out a little late. Mussolini was on top of it right away, and he could have used your support, but communism was a problem. And he was the first guy to tell you this because he was a communist himself at one time. Reformed, call this new ideology fascism, whatever that was, right? Because he evolved throughout his life, even as a fascist. I think Mussolini became more integrally minded. Unfortunately, as he's pushed away by the British because of democratic sensibilities, he's forced into the camp of the failed Austrian patriot. And that's a crime nobody's ever really talked about, other than a few historians who have been willing to be honest. Because in the West, Lord knows, we've been propagandized into automatrons, into little liberal automatrons in the West, because World War II is one of the most lied about events in history. And the Spanish Civil War is a dividing line before the actual Great Second War breaks out. It's a fascinating study. So, as we conclude here, I'd like to read to you this paragraph here from Valeri's book, if I may. One short paragraph to conclude this. All right, here we go. The Spanish Civil War, in conjunction with the Ethiopian War and its aftermath, completed the transformation of the League of Nations into a communist front organization and an anti-fascist and anti-Nazi instrument. This trend had been begun by Maxim Leninov when Russia was admitted to the League in 1934. It furthered by the establishment of a popular front government in France in 1936. And by the peace ballot movement in England in 1935. The idea of collective security against alleged aggressor nations was the key to this process. Litvinov and the Russians, here we go, were able to convince the League and Western liberals generally that only fascist and Nazi totalitarianism were aggressive and the sole international evil, thus cleverly distracting attention from the threat of Soviet totalitarianism to democracy and peace. For just about 10 years, and this threat was ignored until the Cold War between the Western nations and Soviet Russia was forecast by Winston Churchill in his Fulton, Missouri speech in March 1946, and officially proclaimed by President Truman March 12, 1947. For a decade, Western liberalism had enthusiastically aided in the process of raising Soviet Russia to a dominant position in the old world. Ladies and gentlemen, you wonder why we're at where we're at? Because the classical liberals, the Republicans, the conservatives, Even the Democrats at the time never saw the threat coming down the pipe. They were blind to this fact, and they've been lied to by massive Soviet propaganda post-World War II, have been for a long time. A decade after the Great War was over, that's when they figured it out. Really? You want to know why we have, House and un-American activities? What was that, in the 50s? Early 50s, late 40s, right? You wonder why Ronald Reagan is dealing with communists in Hollywood, well, right, with Lucille Ball. You wonder why we have rumors of infiltration of spies within the government, the Venona secrets, right? You want to know why America is being infiltrated? You want to know why in 1960s we start this sexual revolution? We were infiltrated. And the political right in America was completely blind. And whenever you mention this, they call you a conspiracy theorist. Guys, think what you want about Mussolini. He made a lot of mistakes. I agree with you. But in the case of the Spanish Revolution, he called it just right, and he was ahead of everybody at that time. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Well, thank you for joining me. This is part 7 of Mussolini, an Italian-American perspective. I want to thank you for joining me again. This is Frank, signing off for Frankly Speaking. Good night, everybody.